In the autumn of 1944, when the Japanese merchant fleet was hemorrhaging tonnage at a rate its naval architects had never imagined possible, America's Gato-Class submarines were the most feared weapons in the Pacific Ocean. They moved beneath the surface in silence, threading through waters that Japanese escort commanders had convinced themselves were defended, and they struck convoys that had no adequate answer to what was killing them. The submarines that had left Pearl Harbor in the weeks after December 7, 1941, when the Pacific Fleet lay broken in the shallows of the harbor and the outcome of the war felt genuinely uncertain, had matured by 1944 into an instrument of economic strangulation that would ultimately prove as decisive as any fleet action, any island invasion, any bombing campaign. They did not look like weapons of mass destruction. They looked like long gray cylinders riding low in the harbor chop, men in khaki standing on their decks in the tropical light. But what happened next, in the years after the Japanese surrender, almost no one remembers. The Gato-Class was not the first American fleet submarine, but it was the first built in sufficient numbers to constitute a strategic force. Design work began in the late 1930s, when the Navy's submarine service was a small, underfunded branch operating boats that were already obsolescent by the standards of what Germany and Japan were deploying. The engineers at the Bureau of Ships drew on lessons accumulated through 2 decades of interwar experimentation and produced a hull that was longer, faster, and more capable than anything the United States had previously committed to steel. At 311 feet, and displacing 1,525-ton surface, the Gato was a large submarine by the standards of its era, large enough to carry provisions and fuel for 60-day patrols across the vast distances of the Pacific, large enough to house a crew of 60 to 70 men in the chronic discomfort that submarine service demanded, large enough to mount 10 torpedo tubes and carry 24 reloads. Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, laid down the first hole in 1940. The boat commissioned as USS Drum in November 1941, 3 weeks before the attack that would define the war she had been built to fight. By the end of the war, 77 Gato-Class submarines had been completed. They and their successor classes, the nearly identical Belau with its deeper crush depth and the refined tench, formed the backbone of the Pacific submarine offensive that sent to the bottom approximately 5.5 million tons of Japanese shipping. The arithmetic of that accomplishment is worth pausing over. Japan was an island nation dependent on imported raw materials, oil, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, rice, for both its industrial war machine and its civilian population. The submarines did not merely sink ships, they severed supply lines. They denied factories their inputs. They reduced the operational range of the Imperial Japanese Navy by strangling the tanker fleet that fed its ships. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reflecting on the Pacific War, would credit the submarine service with having made the ultimate outcome inevitable. The Gato-Class boats were the instruments through which that judgment was rendered. The Pacific submarine campaign was not what the Navy had planned and not what the submarine service had trained for. American pre-war doctrine envisioned submarines operating primarily in support of fleet actions, scouting, attacking enemy warships, screening friendly formations. The reality of 1942 and 1943 was something different. A guerre de course, a commerce war conducted across millions of square miles of ocean against a merchant fleet that had not expected to be the primary target and was inadequately defended against it. The submarine commanders who fought that war improvised. They developed tactics that the training manuals did not contain. They pushed their boats and their crews into patrols that lasted until the torpedoes ran out, into waters that intelligence said were mined and patrolled, into engagements that sometimes involved surfaced gunfire when torpedoes were scarce. The early months of the campaign were marked by a failure that the submarine service would not fully acknowledge for years. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's standard weapon, was defective in multiple ways simultaneously. Its depth mechanism ran too deep. Its magnetic exploder was unreliable. Its contact exploder was too hard, causing the detonator to crush on impact rather than fire. Submarine commanders who pressed home attacks at genuine personal risk and reported no results were told by the Bureau of Ordnance that the fault lay in their tactics. The fault lay in the weapon. It took until late 1943 after commanders in the field had conducted their own unauthorized tests and the evidence had become impossible to deny for the defects to be corrected. The men who fought the early submarine campaign did so with a weapon that frequently failed them, and they persisted anyway. When the torpedoes finally worked as designed, the results were catastrophic for Japan. By late 1944, the submarine offensive had destroyed the Japanese tanker fleet to the point where the Imperial Japanese Navy was unable to maintain fuel reserves at its home bases and was conducting operations, including the Leyte Gulf battle in October 1944, partly from forward staging areas closer to the oil sources in the Dutch East Indies. The connection between what Gato-Class submarines had done to Japanese tankers in 1943 and 1944 and what happened to the Japanese battle fleet at Leyte Gulf is direct and documented. The submarines strangled the logistical foundation on which Japanese naval power rested, and the fleet that fought at Leyte Gulf was fighting on a foundation that had already been fatally undermined. The human cost of the Pacific submarine campaign was proportional to what it accomplished. Of the approximately 16,000 men who served in American submarines during the war, around 3,500 did not come back, a loss rate of roughly 22%, the highest of any branch of the United States Armed Forces. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. Some were sunk by depth charges, some hit mines, some were lost to causes that were never determined and never will be, their crews joining the permanent inventory of those the sea keeps. The men who went on eternal patrol, as the submarine service's phrase had it, did so aboard boats that were, in some cases, boats that their successors would later struggle to honor appropriately. The war ended in August 1945 with a suddenness that left the submarine force in a peculiar position. The Japanese surrender came before the planned invasion of the home islands, an operation in which the submarine service had been assigned extensive roles: mining approaches, scouting beaches, extracting downed airmen, supporting amphibious operations. The planning documents existed. The orders were drafted. None of it was executed. The submarines that had spent the war's final months preparing for an invasion that never came were redirected to repatriation work, recovering Allied prisoners of war from camps throughout the Japanese-controlled territory, a task that had its own particular weight for crews that had spent years conducting a campaign against the country's ability to sustain itself. The men they recovered from those camps were, in part, survivors of a system whose collapse the submarines had accelerated. Demobilization began almost immediately. The Navy had entered the war with a handful of fleet submarines and had built, through the extraordinary industrial mobilization of 1942 through 1945, a force of more than 200 modern fleet boats. It now needed to decide what to do with them. The question was not simple because the answer depended on assessments of the future that were genuinely uncertain in the autumn of 1945 about the nature of the post-war strategic environment, about the role of submarine warfare in any future conflict, about the rate at which the new weapons then being absorbed from German technology would transform what a submarine was and what it could do. The German submarine technology captured at the end of the European War provided the context within which the American submarine force would have to reinvent itself or become obsolete. The type Daunheat U-boat, which the Germans had developed too late to deploy in significant numbers, represented a fundamental advance over everything that had preceded it. The type Daunterfreus was designed for submerged operation rather than for the surface cruising that had characterized all previous submarine tactics. It had a hydrodynamic hull optimized for underwater performance rather than surface speed. It had a large battery capacity that allowed it to sustain high underwater speeds for extended periods. It had a snorkel, a tube that allowed the diesel engines to run while the boat was submerged at periscope depth, recharging batteries without surfacing. Against a type Bunny White, the Gato and its sisters looked like what they were: weapons of the past. The United States Navy did not discard this lesson. It launched, beginning in 1947, the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, known universally as Guppy, to convert existing fleet submarines to something approaching Type Bunny Wine capability. The Guppy program was not a replacement for a new submarine class. It was an acknowledgement that the existing hulls represented too much invested capital to discard, and that technology could be applied to transform them, at least partially, into something that could compete in the new strategic environment. Gato-Class submarines were among the first candidates for guppy conversion, though their older hulls and lower crush depths made them less suitable for the most ambitious versions of the program than the slightly newer Belau and Tench classes. The guppy conversion process involved removing the deck guns that fleet submarines had carried, weapons that were becoming strategically irrelevant as snorkeling made surface operation dangerous, streamlining the conning tower into a more hydrodynamic fairwater, enlarging the battery capacity, and installing the snorkel. The result was a boat that looked dramatically different from its wartime configuration, sleeker, lower in profile, stripped of the deck hardware that had characterized the pre-war design aesthetic. It was faster underwater and could remain submerged far longer. It was also, in the judgment of the crews who transitioned to it from the wartime configuration, a different kind of machine, one that committed fully to the underwater world in a way the wartime fleet submarine had not. Not every Gato-Class submarine received guppy conversion. The decision depended on hull condition, on the strategic calculus of the Navy's submarine force structure, and on the simple arithmetic of available funding in the post-war budget environment. Boats that were deemed unsuitable for conversion or that were surplus to requirements, even in their existing configuration, were assigned to the Navy's reserve fleet, the so-called mothball fleet that represented the institutional memory of the Navy's wartime expansion and the strategic hedge against a future in which that expansion might be needed again. Reserve fleet submarines were preserved according to procedures developed through experience, engines drained and coated, electrical systems dehumidified, hatches sealed against the weather, hulls periodically inspected. They rode at anchor in protected anchorages, awaiting a call that might or might not come. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 and created the first test of the post-war American military establishment, did not generate significant demand for submarine forces. The conflict was fundamentally a ground war in which naval power played supporting roles, blockade, gunfire support, carrier aviation, but in which submarine warfare had little direct application. Some reserve submarines were reactivated and returned to training service, and the submarine force contributed to the war effort primarily by maintaining Cold War patrol commitments, while the surface Navy concentrated its assets on the Korean theater. The Gato-Class boats that had not been selected for guppy conversion continued to age in reserve, their strategic relevance diminishing with each passing year as the Soviet submarine force, equipped with its own captured German technology and its own rapidly advancing design bureau, defined the threat that the American submarine force was being configured to counter. The strategic environment of the early Cold War assigned to American submarines a mission quite different from the Pacific Commerce War. The Soviet Union was not a maritime trading nation in the sense that Japan had been. Commerce raiding on the Pacific model was not a viable strategy against the principal adversary. American submarines in the Cold War were configured primarily for anti-submarine warfare, hunting Soviet submarines before they could reach their launch or patrol positions, and for intelligence gathering, creeping into Soviet coastal waters to monitor exercises, intercept communications, and count the ships and aircraft of a navy that the West was still struggling to understand. The fleet submarine of 1944, with its emphasis on torpedo volume and long surface range, was only partially suited to these missions. The converted boats were better suited. The unconverted boats were less and less useful. The transfer of Gato-Class submarines to foreign navies began in the late 1940s and accelerated through the 1950s as the Mutual Defense Assistance Program channeled American military equipment to allies whose own navies needed to be built up against the Soviet threat. The logic was straightforward. Boats that the American Navy no longer required in its own order of battle represented genuine capability for smaller Allied navies that could not afford to build modern submarines from scratch. Greece received American fleet submarines, as did Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, and other nations whose strategic situations created a requirement for underwater warfare capability. The Gato and its sister classes spread through the non-Soviet world in a diaspora of steel and diesel that continued into the 1970s. The foreign navies that received these transfers used them in earnest. The Brazilian Navy operated Gato-Class submarines into the 1970s. The Turkish Navy operated transferred American fleet submarines into the 1980s, a remarkable longevity for hulls that had been laid down in the early 1940s. The Greek Navy's submarine force, equipped with transferred American boats, represented a genuine deterrent capability in a regional security environment that included tensions with Turkey and the lingering memory of Axis occupation. For these navies, the Gato-Class boat was not a museum piece or a training aid. It was the primary instrument of underwater warfare, maintained and operated with the seriousness that genuine strategic responsibility demands. The transfers also served American interests in ways that went beyond simple alliance management. Boats transferred to foreign navies carried American equipment, American procedures, and American doctrine. The officers and enlisted men who trained on them trained with American advisors and in American methods. The submarine forces of allied nations were, in a practical operational sense, interoperable with American forces in ways that expanded the effective reach of American naval power without requiring the United States to man and maintain the boats itself. Military assistance was, among its other functions, a mechanism for extending influence through hardware. And the Gato-Class submarine, with its genuine capability and its American pedigree, was effective hardware. The fate of the Gato-Class boats that remained in American service through the 1950s was shaped by the Navy's accelerating transition to nuclear propulsion. USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, commissioned in September 1954 and demonstrated within months that the relationship between submarines and the surface, the requirement to snorkel to recharge batteries to come shallow for communications, had been severed at its root. A nuclear submarine did not need to surface for any reason that could not be deferred essentially indefinitely. It could sustain high underwater speeds for as long as the crew could endure, which was a function of food supply and human psychology rather than fuel or battery capacity. The strategic implications were immediate and profound, and they rendered the conventional submarine, however well converted, however carefully maintained, a weapon of the second order. The diesel-electric boats did not disappear from the American inventory immediately. They remained useful for training, for inshore operations, for missions where the extraordinary expense of nuclear power was not justified by the strategic stakes. But the direction of investment was clear after Nautilus, and the clear direction of investment determined the institutional priority that shaped everything else. The assignment of the best personnel, the allocation of maintenance funding, the attention of the senior leadership. Conventional submarines in the post-Nautilus Navy occupied the same awkward position that propeller-driven aircraft had occupied in the Air Force after the advent of the jet. Technically capable, genuinely useful in certain roles, but unmistakably secondary in an order of battle defined by the new technology. The Gato-Class boats that were retired from American service in the late 1950s and 1960s met fates distributed across a spectrum from preservation to destruction. Some were transferred to the reserve fleet and held there for years before final disposal. Some were used as target ships, sunk by naval weapons in exercises designed to test the effectiveness of those weapons and the tactics for employing them. The use of retired submarines as targets carried its own particular weight. Machines that had spent the war evading depth charges and torpedoes were now being sunk by them, deliberately, in waters chosen for convenience rather than strategic position, their hulls serving a final utilitarian purpose before joining the seafloor. The submarines that were sunk as targets, technically designated X, followed by their original names, a bureaucratic prefix that stripped them of their identity while recording it, disappeared into depths that in some cases have since been located by sport divers and in some cases have not. The wreck of USS Drum, the first Gato-Class boat commissioned, lies not in the depths of the Pacific, but on a park lawn in Mobile, Alabama, where she has been preserved as a memorial since 1969. Drum's survival was not inevitable. It required decisions made at specific moments by specific people who concluded that the boat's history warranted preservation rather than disposal. Those decisions were made against a background in which the default outcome for retired naval vessels was scrapping. And scrapping was cheaper, simpler, and more consistent with the Navy's institutional priorities than the complications of public display. The scrapping of surplus naval vessels in the post-war decades was an industrial operation of considerable scale. Shipbreakers in Baltimore, in New Orleans, in ports along the Gulf Coast processed retired vessels by the hundreds. A submarine presented particular challenges for the shipbreaker. The pressure hull required different handling than a surface ship's single-bottom construction, and the spaces inside were configured for crew habitation rather than for the convenience of the men dismantling them. But the fundamental operation was the same. Cut the hull into sections, sort the metal by alloy, load it onto trucks or barges, deliver it to the smelter. The yield per submarine was modest compared to a battleship or a carrier, but the logic was identical. The metal had value. The machine as a machine did not. Some Gato-class boats were sunk in place rather than scrapped. Their condition too deteriorated for economical scrapping, their location unsuitable for towing to a breaker. These deliberate sinkings, documented in Navy records, created artificial reefs in waters where the visibility and depth made them accessible to divers in subsequent decades. The transformation of a wartime submarine into a dive site was not, in the 1960s and 1970s, a recognized category of historical preservation. It was a disposal method. The fact that sport divers would later find these wrecks and photograph them and describe them in dive guides, that the hulls would accumulate marine life and become, in the perception of the diving community, objects of interest and even beauty, was not anticipated by the men who signed the sinking orders. The submarines that survived as museum ships did so through a combination of factors that varied from case to case but shared a common element: the intervention of organized human will at a moment when the default alternative was destruction. USS Cobia, a Gato-class boat that conducted 6 war patrols and received a Presidential Unit citation, is preserved at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc, the city where she was built, on a Great Lakes shipway that produced 28 fleet submarines during the war. The choice of Manitowoc as Cobia's final home connects the machine to its origins in a way that gives preservation its particular meaning. The people of the community where the boat was built have the opportunity, if they choose to take it, to understand what their wartime labor produced and what it accomplished. USS Kavala, which sank the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku in June 1944, one of the most consequential single submarine attacks of the Pacific War, is preserved in Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. Shokaku had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and had been one of the most capable ships in the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. The submarine that sank her lies now in a Texas coastal park, accessible to visitors who may or may not know what they are looking at, within sight of the Gulf of Mexico rather than the waters where the action occurred. The disjunction between a machine's wartime significance and its peacetime location is, in preserved naval vessels, almost invariably extreme. History happened where geography required it to happen. Preservation happens where the institutions that maintain it have their address. USS Croker, a Gato-class boat credited with sinking 11 ships in 6 war patrols, is preserved in Buffalo, New York, at the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park. USS Bowfin, a Below-class submarine known during the war as the Pearl Harbor Avenger for the tonnage she sent to the bottom in 9 war patrols, is preserved at Pearl Harbor itself, adjacent to the USS Arizona Memorial, the Alpha and Omega of the Pacific War, visible from each other across the harbor basin. These survivals are not accidents. They represent deliberate choices by veterans organizations, municipal governments, naval institutions, and private donors who concluded that the physical presence of the machine was a form of testimony that no other medium could replicate. What the museum submarines represent, to the visitors who walk through them, to the volunteers who maintain them, to the veterans who still, in diminishing numbers, can speak to what life inside them was like, is access to a reality that cannot be reconstructed from documents or photographs or even film. The interior of a Gato-class submarine is a place that defeats abstraction. The spaces are genuinely small. The bunks are genuinely narrow. The machinery is genuinely everywhere, occupying every corner that crew members learn to navigate by habit in total darkness, because the patrols ran day and night, and the men slept in shifts, and the lights were not always on when you needed to get from the torpedo room to the control room quickly. A visitor who spends an hour walking through USS Cobia, or USS Kavala, or USS Drum comes away with a knowledge of what these spaces were like that no other source can provide. That knowledge has a particular kind of value when the last men who lived in those spaces are nearly all gone. The Gato-Class submarines that did not survive as museum ships are gone in ways that differ from the disappearance of lost aircraft or destroyed tanks. Some are on the bottom of the Pacific in waters thousands of feet deep, their hulls holding the remains of the men who went down with them. The 52 lost American submarines of the war, the 3,500 men who did not come back from their patrols. These are, under American law and naval tradition, war graves, protected from disturbance and beyond the reach of the salvage operations that have recovered other wartime shipwrecks. They will remain where they are until the sea does what it does to steel over centuries, which is to reduce it, slowly, to a stain on the sediment. The boats that were scrapped are gone more completely, reduced to ingot and recycled into products whose connection to their origin is invisible and untraceable. The boats that were sunk as targets are gone into the middle depths of the Atlantic and the Pacific, their hulls accessible to technical divers in some cases and invisible in others. The boats that were transferred to foreign navies ended their service in foreign ports and were scrapped by foreign shipbreakers, their histories recorded in American archives and in the records of the receiving navies, their physical presence gone from the world. The accounting of what was built and what was lost and what was saved is, finally, an accounting of decisions made in sequence by people operating in their own contexts with their own priorities that produced this specific distribution of survival and disappearance. The Gato-Class is now nearly 80 years removed from the war it was built to fight. The men who designed it are gone. The men who built it are nearly all gone. The men who sailed it to war, who loaded the torpedoes and tracked the targets and went through the crash dives when the sonar picked up a patrol aircraft, are gone or nearly so. What remains is the metal in the small fraction of hulls that survived, and the record in the archives and the accounting in the numbers. 77 submarines built, 25 patrols on average per boat, 5.5 million tons of Japanese shipping sent to the bottom, 3,500 American submariners who did not return. The machines that accomplished those things were, when the war ended, surplus property. Most of them are gone. A few of them remain, riding at museum moorings in harbor water that has no memory of what they did, waiting for visitors who may not know what they are looking at, but who stand inside the steel and feel, without always being able to say why, that they are in a place that matters. If the fate of the Gato-Class submarines has stayed with you, there is another American war machine whose story runs on a parallel track. Built in the same desperate years, committed to the same unforgiving ocean, and forgotten with the same quiet finality. That story is waiting for you on Lost War Machines.